All right, thank you, everyone. This is Angela Abrams with the Department of Early Learning, and I also want to introduce Ryan, who's also on the line from Child Care Aware of Washington. Ryan, you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody.
There he is. All right, so the purpose of today is really for a few things, is to make sure that we have an opportunity to share with all of you the work that's been happening lately over the last couple of years related to compensation and early learning, and then also to introduce the Compensation Technical Work Group that Dell is helping to lead. One of the things that we want to do is to give some background information, and towards the end of the webinar today, we are going to introduce the process for community applications to be a part of the Compensation Technical Work Group. So if that's one of the reasons why you're listening in, just let you know that's coming up towards the end of our presentation today, and that will be included in the overview. For the sake of the flow of the recording as well as conversation, you do have the ability to type questions into the question box. And if possible, I can, answer those as we move through the conversation if it's specific to that area. But otherwise, we'll get to some questions at the end. And if we see a predominant theme that keeps coming up that we want to make sure that we're doing a FAQ for or follow-up written correspondence for, that will also give us a chance to do that as well. Next slide. So I went over some of this actually already, but just wanted to reiterate that the current first part of this presentation is really going over what's been happening now. How has the conversation of compensation evolved over the last couple of years? And even prior to that, there's longer history than even that time frame, and to think about where we are today and how does this feed into the work moving forward. We want to make sure that we're really transparent about the work and deliverables of the Compensation Technical Work Group. There's a lot to happen between now and the due date of our report, which we'll talk about later at the end of 2018, and to make sure that we answer any questions and touch all of what's needed related to the application process for community representation.
Hey, Angela, I just had somebody come up in the chat box and say the webinar is still on mute. So just checking to make sure that you can hear Angela when she's speaking. Okay.
So it looks like most people can hear, so I'm wondering if someone else is participating who cannot hear, you may want to call in using another option. You have both your computer option to connect with the webinar, but there also is a phone option if you would like to dial in directly. One other thing is, as this information is being recorded, you will, not that it's ideal for those that are on the line, but we'll also have the chance to watch the recorded version and follow up. So the next slide here is really just talking about how compensation is often tied to an overall framework for policy and early learning. This is one example from the National Association for the Education of Young Children. But to be honest, there are many examples out there regarding policy for early learning, and that compensation is a key part of overall quality and overall program success. We know in looking at this 6 essential policy areas from NIAC, NACI if you live on the East Coast, is really looking at the foundation of integration of services, quality assurance, equity and workforce diversity, and compensation parity as being foundational policy principles that guide the overarching structure of a house that sits above. So when you think about the overall components, whether it relates to career pathways and scholarships and qualifications and the data that we collect on the workforce, we want to make sure that the decisions that we make from a policy standpoint is grounded in those 4 policy-making principles. There are other guiding documents and frameworks that speak to a similar structure, but what you'll find across many and all that I've come across is that compensation is tied up into an overall picture that's tied to quality, making sure that we're supporting community, building up community workforce as well as workforce diversity, and that services are integrated in a way that makes sense from the policy standpoint as well as the individuals that are within the early learning system. Next slide.
And I just want to chime in here. This is Anna. We had somebody in the chat box say that he could only see the first slide. Just somebody, can you let me know, please, are the slides changing as I'm changing them? Can you see the slides moving? Slides are overlapping.
Yeah, it looks like there's a little bit of a delay in the connection, Anna. I do see some overlap, but overall they are changing. It's just it takes a minute for it to get caught up.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
So when we think about the work that's ahead, I'm also starting to touch in on some of the efforts that we've been putting into over the last few years, one of which is recently the governor's office received a grant that Dell helped to administer that we'll go over, that was awarded by the National Governors Association focused on compensation. During that year, it was decided as a team of Washington stakeholders that participated in that we wanted a long-term goal that really led us to making sure that we're keeping in mind the diversity of the workforce in our goals, as well as how do we make sure that we advance the system in a way that is really meaningful for where we are headed for our state. So our long-term goal, and I'm going to actually read this to you, is Washington has qualified, diverse, and competitively compensated educators across all early learning settings to help children reach their potential and to eliminate race and income as predictors of school readiness. And so that's a very large goal for many of you who have been doing this work for a long time, and I know many of you on the line have been. And what we really want to take away from that is that we want to prioritize building a diverse workforce. So as we have future workforce expansion needs as listed below, that we're really thinking about how do we make sure that we're supporting communities, that we are thinking about building out strategies that meet people where they are and advancing from that starting point, and that highlighting in on Dell's goal that race and income are no longer predictors of school readiness. So wanting to build in a strong equity lens to the work that we do as we continue to support growth for the early learning professionals in Washington. ECAP expansion is going to allow us to serve more children through ECAP, which naturally has an impact on the number of professionals that we need serving those ECAP classrooms. So the workforce demand is required within ECAP expansion. Workforce recruitment and retention ties into many of these areas, knowing that we want to continue to recruit people into the early learning workforce and to retain them so that we can see that continuity of care for children and families, but then also to make sure that the investments that we're making within the system are retained within the system. We also know that with the progression of standards for ECAP and early achievers, as well as the newly proposed WAC that's going through negotiated rulemaking now that will eventually lead into a new WAC set of rules. We want to make sure that we're keeping all of what's in mind and what's proposed there so that when we start working on implementation that we're mindful of the impacts and the system requirements that will need to be in place. And then although it's not necessarily directly an early learning goal or mission to make sure that we're addressing this, but the last bullet is something that naturally impacts all of our work for those who are in the P3 realm, thinking about full day kindergarten and K3 class size reduction and the impact that it has in Washington as far as we're pulling from a similar workforce. We're pulling from people who have said, hey, I am really interested in working with children and families, or I think I want to go into early learning and I'm not quite sure where should I go, what should I do. We want to make sure that we're supporting the full system, and that oftentimes it means working in close partnership with those that are from other state agencies or working directly with the K3 population of the workforce and children and families, so that there is continuity of system. When we think earlier of that house graphic, we talked about the integration of services, and this is a piece of it. So overall, not only is compensation related to making sure that we're able to reach some of these milestones, but also a way for us to think about our system pieces in alignment. Are we as clear as possible when we describe what a career pathway is for someone who's interested in the early learning profession? And what if they choose to work someday in the K3 setting? Is our pathway allowing them to do that? So as we think about the challenge that's ahead of us in writing a recommendations report related to compensation and being able to reduce staff turnover and build from communities to make sure we retain the diverse workforce that we have and attract more into the early learning field, we want to make sure that it's from that holistic approach so that we have a system that's truly sustainable. Ryan, go ahead and take it away.
the Director of Policy and Advocacy Services with Child Care Aware of Washington. And I'm going to talk a little about this work that is at this point. Again, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide. What you see here is a statement from our state's compensation policy paper, which kind of tries to quickly and succinctly identify the problem and the opportunity. I think everyone on this phone knows the opportunity, which is high quality early childhood education provides up to a 13 or sometimes even more 13% return on investment. This from the Heckman equation. So there's a lot of research in this number. But that research is also clear that we only get that return when the early childhood education that child is experiencing is very high quality. And when we've dived into what makes high quality education for these kids, the two biggest things that the research continually shows us is that we need highly qualified teachers with a background in early childhood development, people that know how baby brains develop. And then those interactions between those adults and those kids need to be high quality. And unfortunately, a key component of that formula is supporting our teachers. And the unfortunate part is that just as a society, we have not done that. We've left our early childhood education teachers vulnerable and isolated. And what we're here to talk about is the poverty wages that they've been stuck with for decades now. So next slide, please.
Hey, Ryan, this
and
is
we have.
Oh, hang on, sorry. You're cutting in and out a little bit. I've had a few people let me know. So I don't know if there's anything you can fix on that end there.
Well, I'll try to be as close to the computer and the microphone and everything as possible. So some of the data that we know behind the problem, you can see on this slide. Our teachers rank in the 3rd percentile, and these are all Washington state numbers in wages below things like pet groomers and parking attendants. 40% of our ECE teachers are on state assistance themselves. And that results in a 43% turnover rate amongst our teachers in our preschool programs. And probably what's most concerning long term is that our students who graduate with degrees in early childhood education have the lowest projected of all college.
Ryan, this is Angela. Can you hear me okay?
And if you pull, the impact on children from this data, we know that poverty-stricken teachers have to cope with toxic stress outside of the classroom when they are impact those interactions that they're able. Yeah. Can you hear me?
You're pretty badly scrambled here.
Ryan, we might have to go to a plan.
Can anybody hear me?
It's pretty bad on the recipient end, and I hear it just like any of the other participants, I think, because I'm logged in like a participant. It might be, hello? It might be worth Ryan disconnecting and trying to call back in. I'm wondering if that will help, but maybe I can kind of cover this slide while you do that and see if that makes any improvement.
Okay.
I don't know what else to recommend unless you have another idea.
Yeah, I will unmute you when you call back in.
So Ryan was.
Again.
So as Ryan was mentioning on this slide, it was really important for us to really start outlining in Washington State what does the data tell us. And so as you can see, we know that child care teachers rank in the 3rd percentile of other workers, such as pet groomers, and that 39% of Washington's teachers rely on one or more sources of public income to support the cost of, to support their own basic needs, and that 43% is our average turnover rate, really impacting the continuity of care. We know that students who graduate with ECEs have some of the lowest projected earnings in our college system based on college graduates, and that's a direct impact of our ability to support them within the early learning field in a variety of ways. So this isn't just those that are working within licensed care, it's just those who are graduating in ECE overall. Next slide, Anna. So when we're looking at ways that we can gather existing information, one of the things that we did was to turn towards some of the resources that we have with the National Association for the Education of Young Children. They've recently completed a survey asking the public, what do voters think about the early learning field? What is happening within early learning that would attest to their thoughts related to, do early childhood professionals have it easy? Are they really prepared and educated? And one of the things that we've seen when we start looking at some of this information, and we can share this at a future time if you're interested in seeing the full survey results, is that many people, 76%, believe that educators in early learning are highly skilled, and 23% that they feel that they have fairly easy jobs, so that they're skilled, but their job's easy. And you can kind of start drawing some connections between, I wonder what else the public in this case would be thinking about. But if you look at some of the ones that don't have arrows, the ones that sometimes stand out to me are 37% believe that they are easily replaceable. And many, over almost 60%, 57% believe that the work is part-time. So every single one of those lines on the screen really speaks to a story of what is it that the general population feels related to early learning. When you look at the rest of these surveys, you can see, go to the next slide, Anna, please, that many people believe that the early childhood educators are an important part of our community. 90% actually think that people are compensated and on par with firefighters and nurses. But when you look at the actual data about what people are getting paid, what we're seeing is many of them are closer to other roles that are not on par with firefighters and nurses. So there is a disconnect between what the general voter population believes and also what happens at the state and also national level. We haven't really reiterated that this is really a national dilemma that many people are putting a lot of emphasis into, and Washington is really one of the leaders across the nation in many of the states who's really trying to get a strong plan for how we want to address this moving forward. So I believe that Ryan is on again. Ryan, you want to see if you're clearer?
Yeah, I called back in. Can everybody hear me better now?
I think it's better. Let's see how it goes.
Okay. All right, so I think the only other thing that I wanted to touch on during this slide is that, as Angela just mentioned, that this isn't just a state initiative or a state dynamic or a state problem. This is a national problem, and there are folks on the national level working on it. This slide right here is from NAEYC. They have a whole movement called Power to the Profession that they've launched and are using at the national level to try to move the workforce forward and focus a lot on compensation. Child Care Aware of America has started their Child Care Work campaign, which is very similar, really focused in on the workforce. They're providing targeted support to us in the state, and we are focusing on compensation here. And also, our senator on the national level, Patty Murray, has recently released her new idea for child care. It's the Child Care for Working Families Act, and there's a huge emphasis in that bill as well on not just quality improvement, but also providing fair compensation for that quality teaching. So not only here in the state, but also nationally across the board from all different angles, people recognize that compensation in early childhood education is a huge problem. It needs to be addressed through many different efforts on all levels of the country, basically. Next slide, please. So this next slide is kind of a snapshot, some more data of where our ECE teachers are currently situated, and add some additional context into the problems that they have dealing with these really low wages. And what you see in the first two data points here up on the top is just that predominantly ECE teachers are parents themselves. And so they have, additional costs at home. They have additional stresses at home. They're trying to support their family. They're trying to provide good early learning for their own kids, and they're getting paid poverty wages. And so that makes it very difficult to stay in the workforce and, really try to make a career out of it when even if you're passionate about the work and you're incredibly good at it, if you have higher paying opportunities, which there are a lot of, there's that pressure there to do what's best for your family. And as you see in the bottom two data points there, low wages also make it very difficult for people in our field or people who are interested in going in our field and getting degrees in early childhood education, because you're basically asking people to take out a lot of student debt if we're not able to support them with a scholarship in order to then be paid a poverty wage when they're all done. So that really impacts the whole pipeline of the workforce that we need to bring in, because not only do we need more high quality early learning teachers, but we just need more early learning teachers, period. As more and more people go into the workforce, as more and more young children are in families where all adults in that household work, just the overall need for childcare capacity is increasing. And unfortunately, these low wages hurt the front end of our recruitment pipeline as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and kick it back over to Angela.
So they start to piece together the pieces that are related to what's happening nationally and what's going on at the state level, both from our lessons learned as well as for where we want to head, the vision that we have in front of us. I think one key question to ask is, how does this all fit together? When we look at the research that's been completed, by some experts within the field, as well as look at what other guiding institutions have informed us with, so such as our work with the National Academy of Medicine related to their latest report on transforming the workforce. There's also a new research out produced by them on dual language learners. And when we look at all of that, I think the key pieces continue to come back, and those are the same guiding principles that we're starting to adopt and hold on to. It's that we know that this takes time. We know that when I say this, I mean just all the conversation around quality and qualifications and roles and compensation. We also know that it's something that is, we want to do in partnership with many. It's not one entity can do everything, and we think that's a great actual benefit. But then the other part of it is wanting to make sure that we have a good direction as we're continuing to head forward. So when we look at this kind of little circle diagram here, it's really just a way to say that no matter what we decide to do as we continue to advance this work, we want to make sure that quality is a part of the conversation, as are roles and qualifications for positions, and that compensation is a critical component. So making sure we have a skilled workforce is something that is a valuable, necessary piece to the overall conversation. We know that we have state commitment as we're continuing to pursue this legislative report that we'll talk more about, not only from the governor's office through the NGA work that we've been doing, the grant that we had mentioned, but then also continuing to look ahead, as well as partners within the early learning realm overall. We recently established a workforce council, an early learning workforce council that kicked off this year, and a big part of what they're interested in is continuing to see how compensation ties into the action plan so that we can continue to have success. As I mentioned earlier about ECAP expansion and the aligned standards, there's a lot that's coming ahead for workforce development, and this is our opportunity to really see how that all interconnects. Next slide. So as we get started in wondering, how is it that where we've been is going to inform where we're going, or how does new research inform where we're going? We want to draw attention to some key milestones that have been happening over the last several years. So first, kicking off with one of an earlier initiative in Washington State, which was the Career and Wage Ladder. And that work has happened and was a part of our system and really drew light to the desire to want to recognize people for their qualifications and to compensate them in relationship to what they've accomplished. That's not a currently active component of the Washington early learning system right now, but there is language that is sometimes referenced in lessons learned and evaluations that point to that period of time. In 2014, Washington was invited to participate in a learning table with 5 other states with the Institute of Medicine focused on the research that I mentioned, transforming the workforce, and that was a report by the National Academies of Medicine. So the Institute of Medicine was an innovation grant that allowed us to think about, okay, knowing this new research is out and available, how are states going to advance that work? And we really focused in Washington on the desire to really look at our policies. We want to make sure that we are focusing on something that is sustainable long-term, that looks at where we are, and that really integrates where we're headed with early achievers, with ECAP, and with the direction overall, so that it's really aligned and as meaningful as we have so many kind of policy shifts that are happening right now with expansion and the newly aligned standards. In 2016, so just last year, we received the National Governors Association grant that I had mentioned, and that really allowed us to go a little bit deeper in the policy conversations that we had initially thought of with the Institute of Medicine. And so we're kind of scaffolding our work along. In the NGA grant work, we really focused on having a stronger position statement, and part of that was reflected earlier when Ryan was going over that, and that will be made available on our website. We completed a strong research brief to start pulling together an annotated bibliography of what was out there, what are other states doing, what are the lessons learned in Washington as well as in other parts of our country, and getting expert advice from, whether it was from the Governors Association, from the National Academy of Medicine, from NIAC, and others who are really deep in this work. At the same time, when we're starting to go deeper, that's when the Power to the Profession initiative started to happen with NIAC, and Ryan mentioned that earlier, but that's really also looking at roles and qualifications of early learning professionals. Competencies are starting to be relooked at, and starting to think about how do we take where, at a national standpoint, where we're at nationally for knowledge and skills related to the workforce, and start scaling those, but then also start thinking about, and how does compensation fit in. The ECE Workforce Council, as I mentioned earlier, was just kicked off, and it's really supporting how do we kind of bring these many pieces together. We know that Dell leads a component of this work, but we also rely heavily on many of our state partners to help paint the overall big picture and making sure that we're working together to meet workforce needs. In 2017, which is now in July, is when we received the provisoed language and budget that relates to establishing a compensation technical work group. And that work group is really taking all of these lessons learned in Washington and beyond and saying, how do we then pull together a recommendations report for the legislature that really talks about where do we want to go related to compensation? What are some possible strategies? How do our strategies align with recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce, reducing turnover, and making sure that we're working towards parity for compensation? Next slide, and then passing it to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Angela. And this next slide just kind of provides more details on the NGA grant team that Angela mentioned, and I think provided a good summary of. And so I won't go into too many details here, but there are a couple things I wanted to add about this, which is this opportunity from the National Governors Association, which is, you know, another national entity who kind of recognized that we have to do much more to build out and develop our ECE workforce nationally. They put out this grant opportunity very broadly and said, you know, they wanted states who were interested in supporting the workforce. It wasn't a compensation-focused grant, but Governor Inslee responded to it, and we secured a grant. And when we sat down to start figuring out what to do with it, we really, you know, coalesced around the idea that we've implemented early achievers, we're expanding ECAP, we've done a lot of work on career pathways. Now's the time to really focus on compensation, because not only will that infrastructure allow us to pull the data and, you know, and connect it to child outcomes in a way that makes a strong case, but now with the standards that we have in place, the accountability and the, you know, the support for professional development that's there, we have a right situation to go to policymakers with and you know, and basically fight for significant investment into the system, which, you know, is obviously going to be necessary in order to get wages up. So I was excited to be, you know, in a state where we're at that point now where many other states who receive these grants, felt like they weren't to that point yet, and they're doing some more standards work, alignment, articulation, those kind of things. But I'm glad that our team, really focused on compensation. And yeah, as Angela mentioned, we produced a messaging document to kind of kick off the effort. We've consolidated a lot of ideas from all over the country on what they've done. But more than anything, we recognize that we need to unleash a public campaign, a messaging campaign to really articulate the problems. I think that polling that Angela shows some gaps that we still have with the public and understanding our workforce and understanding the need for better compensation. And if we are able to roll out an effective public campaign like that, then we'll be well positioned to actually secure investment to start dealing with the problem. Next slide. In parallel to the NGA grant team doing their work, the Early Learning Action Alliance and Child Care Aware, YMCA, SEIU, and others, on the advocate side of things, were also recognizing that compensation needed to be dealt with urgently, and brought a piece of legislation to the legislature this last year in order to try to get something started with it. Again, there was still kind of a lack of awareness of just how big the problem is from policymakers, and so how things landed during session was the development of this work group that we're kicking off today, where Dell has been tasked by the legislature to bring together stakeholders, go through this bibliography, look at ideas, look at the structures that we have in place in our state, and ultimately develop recommendations for increasing ECE wages that will be submitted back to the legislature prior to the next large legislative session, which will start in January of 2019. So we're hoping to use this time to bring people together, basically unite the field behind kind of a common vision for how to address compensation. And then by the time the next long legislative session comes around, we'll be well positioned to achieve some victories in that space. And can we go ahead and get to the next slide, please? And what you see here is basically the time commitment that we're asking from folks if you do want to be part of this work group. We plan on having phone webinar meetings twice a month on Mondays, and then we're also going to have some in-person meetings. And in between that, we're really hoping that people that sign up to be part of this group will really, be able and willing to, put some work into developing the recommendations, being a part. We want this to be kind of a shared process in developing this report, so that, when the time comes to actually advocate for it, we have a lot of people who are really bought into it, who really understand it and can speak to it, so that we can effectively advocate for it. Next slide, please. And I'll go ahead and kick it back to Angela.
So as we think about transitioning from here and kicking off more fully with getting the technical work group started, in the 13 entities that were named, some of which were specific entities that Dell doesn't have a lot of flexibility with saying, here's the candidate that would best meet that person. And in that case, we've asked those individuals to put forth the name that they want to represent the work. But there are positions, 5 community positions that are named that will require a community application. And this is really to just address the vast number of people who may be interested and how we can make sure that we're giving everyone a chance to weigh in. So whether if you're calling in today because that someone might be you, the applications will be available on the DEL website after this webinar. So you can go and find them there, and I can share more information with you at the end on where you'll be able to see those. We have a link at the end. And then the other part of this is if you know somebody who would be great and you want to recommend them, please guide them to the website so that we can make sure that we are getting the word out and getting as many people as possible. We do hope, and you'll see this in the application, that people have some general working knowledge about what it means to advance this strategy for the state, and can contribute to the conversation in that way, is willing to kind of dig their hands into some research and helping to craft the recommendations report that we would then provide in December of 2018. So the timeline is that the applications will be posted now, and they will be available on the website to be printed. They are not too long. Ideally, you'll be able to get through them fairly quickly. The timeline is that November 13th, applications are due by noon. And then we have a small work team that will be reviewing and putting those together. In the event that we have many people for a certain position that are interested, we will conduct finalist interviews just to make sure that we have a chance to ask any clarifying questions, as well as the individual who might be participating in those finalist interviews if they have any questions of the work or the role or responsibilities. We'll then notify new members on the 20th and all to confirm their interest, and then all applicants will be notified, sorry about that, on the 24th. So in the appointed members, you can go to the next slide, please. On the appointed members, here's some examples of what I mentioned earlier, people who are pointedly asked, send your person forward. And then on the selected members, these are the only individuals that will have the application as it looks on the website. The other appointed members are receiving a separate correspondence that outlines the responsibilities and getting the name of their recommended individual that would come forth that way. So once we get, next slide please, once we get all of the applications in, we will put the applications through a selection criteria framework where we'll be looking at the knowledge, interest, and expertise of the individuals, their ability to commit, meaning attending the in-person meetings, as well as webinars, and being able to work outside of the meeting. That's still a little bit of dependent on how the work group evolves as far as what that work outside of the meeting looks like. And then also making sure that we're allowing for opportunities for the work plan to evolve. Just given some of the work that we've done in other areas, it's our best estimate that those are the times that we would more than likely need to be checking in with the work group. We want to make sure that we're prioritizing the representation of diverse communities. This includes both race and ethnicity and linguistic, the geographic location, and where they may represent different parts of the state, whether it's rural or urban, western, central, or eastern part of Washington, and kind of looking at getting a broad sense of where people are from so that they can best represent the work overall. With that, we do have some funding for travel, and we will be coordinating with those that qualify for travel reimbursement as they're selected. And then the other last part is that people are working on representing their position to the best of their ability. So if someone's putting forth their name to represent a certain population, we will be giving thought to, is this person connected to a broader network of individuals or have a means to connect with more people that are within the group that they're selecting to represent. So next slide, I'll go ahead and leave that next slide up while we do have a few questions that have come through. So Ryan, if you're up for it, do you want to take a few questions that have been coming? So I'm going to go ahead and go in order of the relevance in which we've been talking. One is that this seems like a very tight timeline, and it is a tight timeline. There's a lot of work ahead. We want to make sure that we're giving people the chance to receive the information. That's one of the reasons why we chose to do a webinar and make it available and recorded so that we can help to do that and continue to share this information even if someone's not able to participate. So my hope would be that we can use this as a platform to share what we can and to recruit people who may be interested. We do want to make sure if someone's interested in submitting their application in their primary language that they're welcome to. One thing worth noting is that much of the research that we'll be looking at and reviewing may be predominantly in English, and I just want to put that as an FYI out there. Not that it's any reason why not everyone can participate, but it's just going to be a lot of information to digest. And this is resources that Dell doesn't necessarily put together, but as we look at national research and start building that in. But definitely we want to make sure that we're creating opportunities to pull from as many people as possible. One thing that I also want to mention as it relates to embracing the diversity of the group is that the Workforce Council is also helping to oversee some compensation work. Within the Workforce Council, we have an expectation to be working on establishing a community engagement strategy, and that's really kind of at the early stages of figuring out how that would work, but we anticipate will be done in the next couple of months. And then we can figure out a way to share and gather feedback from communities Our hope is that even if someone does not have the opportunity to have a direct seat, whether it's on the Workforce Council or on this compensation work group, that we would have the ability to create a strategy, because we want to reach the voices of those that might not be able to travel to in-person meetings or participate on a webinar as much as they would like. The average length of in-person meetings are usually full-day meetings, and sometimes may require an overnight stay if that person chooses. So if it's going to be in, Spokane, let's say, for example, and you're from the West Side, you might want to travel the day before. The exact times have not been established, but I would assume that it would be safe to count on that. Another question has been as far as what does it mean for work outside of meetings and how much time per month? I think it really depends on how the work plan evolves. I would assume that in the beginning it might be a little bit heavier in reading and getting caught up to speed in the research and the data that we do have available, and then later on would be working on actual contributing to the actual report writing or doing some additional research or crosswalk of research or things that we may establish as part of the work plan. I don't know if I can say an exact hour, but I would say it'd be safe to assume at least a couple hours outside of the webinars per week. Trying to scroll through the chat thing. In-person meetings, again, this is again about the meetings, will be held the in-person ones will be held at various locations within the state. We have the same commitment to kind of post them throughout the state as needed. For example, with the Workforce Council, we've kind of put that back on the council and said, hey, here's where everyone lives, here's where they're coming from, where do you want to meet? And it's really a group agreed location, sometimes closer to SeaTac, sometimes in Central Washington, and really the group kind of weighs in on where they would like to be through a voting process. I think those are all of the questions that we have related to the logistics of meetings. And then there are two other general questions that have come up, and that has been, will the study look into the affordability for parents? And one thing that we didn't mention is the work that Dell's also leading related to the cost of quality. So the research team at Dell and others who are participating in this process are really thinking about what does quality cost? And I think part of that is a consideration for how do we continue to strive to provide high quality care? What is the real cost of quality care? And how does the workforce fit into that, as well as the cost for parents? So we definitely will be taking lessons learned from there and want to make sure that whatever strategies that we develop or evolve with, I'm kind of speaking for many, I would think, when I say we want to make sure that it's something that is feasible and actually leverages where we want to go instead of putting additional challenges maybe on anyone else, and that would include families and parents. So keeping that as a forefront as part of our guiding principles, but that's not really a viable solution or something personally that I would like to propose, but that's my 2 cents before actually pulling this group together. The other part is related to what does it mean when we talk about poverty wages? That's a term that's used often nationally. When you look at the slide that we shared earlier, that over 40% of our active early learning workforce in Washington is relying on public assistance to meet their basic needs. And the number of people who are worried about having food on the table, and that staff who have at least one child, 57% are worried about having food for their family. And when we use the phrase poverty wages, we're speaking about that the wages are not at a point where they're sustainable for someone to not worry about meeting their basic needs, and that in order to meet basic needs, individuals and families are relying on public assistance to go about their daily life. Another question is related to data and research, if it will be made available for review, even if someone's not in the work group. And yes, on this new link that we have available on the DEL website related to compensation, we're starting to also build out our page on workforce development overall. And we have a slew of information that we want to organize and get on there for you, some of which includes research and data that we've talked about right now today, but then also more, so that as you have an interest in going and looking up maybe research to support something you're doing, or are wondering about what's happening with a certain initiative, we want to make sure that we're starting to post that and have it publicly available. We do have data that both can be shared right now as well as in the near future as we continue to work with pulling together some of our most recent workforce data from the registry and merit, as well as doing a workforce analysis that should be able to be shared in the spring of next year. Anna, any other questions that we haven't gone through?
Yeah, one other just came in. Let me paraphrase it. So actually, there's two that have come in. One says that early on, much attention was paid to early learning professionals and the recruitment/retention issues related to them. The proviso specifies childcare workforce. Will the work group be looking big picture on early learning compensation and recommending accordingly, or only specifically on childcare workers?
I think that's something that I would definitely like to pose back to the group once we're convened. I can tell you that Dell does care about the direct workers, childcare workers, the direct service providers, but then also as we continue to strive to reach a growing number of the workforce and serving more children, it has a natural impact on other support individuals within our early learning system. So we definitely want to keep in mind, what does this mean for recruiting and retaining early learning coaches or other family support specialists or others who are a critical component of the system who may not be in the classroom or on site directly all the time, but that's still a valuable part of the conversation overall for supporting the workforce.
Another question came in about substitute reimbursement, which is, will the substitute be reimbursed?
Are we, I think we're talking about substitutes if someone needed to leave to attend a meeting. Do they qualify for reimbursement? That has been something that has been brought up. If you're thinking specifically to policy around the Dell substitute pool, we have heard the question and the value, and it would be great to participate in some of the Dell initiatives if we could have a reimbursement from the substitute pool to do that. That pulls the policy of the substitute pool away directly from the components that it currently lists, but it has been something that I'm interested in kind of thinking more about. So I can follow up with Anna on who specifically maybe asked that question and get a little bit more information. But just as a side note, we have been thinking about, in general, lessons learned from the substitute pool, and is there anything that we should be considering for the future? And that has come up.
Had a couple more questions come in. One is, what is the name of the white paper and where has it been made available?
So we do have a position statement. That's usually how I refer to it. And as soon as we organize this link here that you'll be able to follow, that's where it will be made available. We haven't been making a ton of improvements to our Dell web pages in regards to professional development lately, and we want to organize some of that, and that will be located there so that we can share that with you.
Another one came in, how would this impact small business owners in early childcare?
The compensation work, I think, is something that when we look at the various strategies, we want to also consider all of the different types of programs. That's one of the reasons why we want a lot of different types of representation as part of not only this technical work group, but the Workforce Council as well. And I don't think that there's any concrete answer that I can give to that right now, other than we're very much aware that we want to keep mindful of the different types of programs, including small business and family child care owners, and continue to fold that dialogue into the conversation and where we land in the recommendations report in December of 2018.
That's all of the questions that have come in.
All right. Ryan, is there anything that you want to add?
Well, I think the only thing I wanted to add is related to that last question, which is, the intent behind the language in the proviso that created this work group was to not only look at ways that we can infuse early childhood programs with more money so that they can pay their staff more and retain them and make quality improvements, but we also wanted a lot of different representation from programs on this group so that we can also look at the cost of doing business and what aspects of our regulations, of our standards, of our protocols, et cetera, equate to additional costs, significant costs for programs that maybe we can relook at that might free up money for wages. So we definitely want to look at this comprehensively from the business perspective. I think that's a big reason why we fought for the Small Business Administration to also be a part of this group and kind of bring some high-level thinking about how other industries with small businesses work as well. So we're trying to look at this from all angles and try to, build a menu of supports, a suite of supports that result in more flexible cash being at these programs. And so when people ask how that will impact a small business, I just want them to know that, we're going to try to look at all aspects of running these businesses to try to come up with whatever ideas we can to start dealing with this problem.
Okay.
We had one last question come in. It is, will the compensation and cost of care work groups wrap up about the same time so that recommendations can be made to the legislature for funding during the next session to increase subsidy rates?
I think it's, we're always working on kind of the timing of things related to that. And one of the things that we are aware of is how do we best create a recommendations report when so much work is still underway and happening. Right now, we do see some information from a national level as far as what the cost of quality goes in other examples, not necessarily in Washington's example, but Washington's example is critical to our platform for the conversation. I would say that I cannot guarantee that everything will be done in the timeline that we need it to, and the timing of when, that might impact any future decisions. But I do know that we're staying in close contact with the cost of quality work so that as soon as we have information or even preliminary information, those early findings can be woven into the overall conversation. And I, in recent conversations, have been connected enough to know that there is a little bit that would allow us to at least dig into what we know at the beginning entry level of that. Also, the cost of quality work is going in phases, and so it could be that we receive one chunk of information first and then something else later. And so being able to allow space for us to digest that and process that and looping in with the research team where needed. So I want to thank everyone for their time today, as well as Ryan and Anna, who have been a part of the work and preparations for this overall. When you look on the website, the Compensation Workgroup will post the applications, and we will be able to continue to add information there on the same link as the work evolves, as well as keeping you updated, and even some historical documents that we've been referencing overall. So with that, I just want to invite you again to consider applying and sharing this information with others. The webinar will also be made available on that part of our website that you can easily share to if you choose to email that out. If you have any other questions, you may reach directly to Anna, and there's her email address, and she'll be sure to either get back to you or do our best to scaffold those questions for any answers that may be needed. Thank you, everyone, and we will talk to you again soon.